Great, let's get started. Thank you very much for meeting with us today. We really appreciate it. To begin, would you mind introducing yourself?
Absolutely. Tanshe, Laranna Scott Dishnakashian. Hello, my name is Laranna Scott, and I'm honored to be calling in today from my home office in Grand Forks, BC, in the shared territory known as the Boundary and home to the Boundary Métis Community Association here in British Columbia. And I am Métis on my mother's side. My family names are Lapine, Laurence, and Taylor. And I am grateful to be a descendant of Ambrose Lapine. That's where I get my Métis ancestry from.
Thank you so much. Before we get into talking about traditional understandings and practices of disability, it would be helpful to know a bit about your personal and professional experience with disability. On a personal level, what has been your relationship to disability?
Well, I have some educational background in disability. I have my early childhood education certificate, as well as diplomas in infant toddler education and special needs education, and Bachelor of Arts degree in child and youth care. And I feel that that very much prepared me for my personal journey with disability. I was gifted with a beautiful daughter who's 14 years old now, who has complex support needs. And she's put me on a path that I never knew I would take, and very grateful for all of the teachings that she's provided me with, as well as the creator on this journey.
Thank you so much. Um, on a professional level, how does the work you do intersect with Indigenous disability?
Absolutely. So I've held a number of roles over the last 25 years in the child and youth care field, working with children with disabilities directly as a support worker, as a consultant with the Aboriginal Infant Development Program, as well as the Aboriginal Supported Child Development Program. And currently, I'm the Indigenous Practice Advisor with the Family Support Institute of BC, and we are a provincial nonprofit agency here in British Columbia that supports families from across our province that have a family member with a disability, diagnosed or not, and across the full lifespan from infancy through the early years, school age, adulthood, elderhood, and end of life. We walk alongside families on their journey and help them to navigate all of the systems along the way and jump through all of the hoops that they need to on this journey. So it's truly an honor to be uh, working in this capacity due to my lived experience in this sector. And I feel like my experience as Trinity's mom has definitely prepared me for this role.
Thank you so much. Um, As you know, IDC BCANDS is currently engaged in a project which involves documenting and preserving knowledge about disability from a traditional Indigenous perspective. Given your extensive knowledge, we would like to ask you about traditional understandings of disability. How would you say the concept of disability has been traditionally understood within the context of your community and culture?
From from my experience and from the teachings I've received from my elders and my work with Indigenous communities across BC, it there's a very different perspective on disability than perhaps um, the mainstream or Western perspective. In a lot of Indigenous cultures and nations and languages, there is no word for disability because they don't view it as the same thing. They see it as a gift. And that's why I said I have a beautiful gift from Creator. That's my daughter. And from teachings from my elders, children are seen as that beautiful gift with their unique strengths and abilities. And traditionally, we would develop those and lift those up and celebrate those, and they would contribute to their communities in the best way that they could. And one elder said to me, you know, way back when, Laranna, um, those with ADHD were our best hunters and gatherers in our nation. Um, And nowadays, one of my elders said, we assess children, we medicate children, we don't celebrate and honor their gifts as we once did. And so there is a significant difference in that perspective. when considering the Indigenous perspective on disability and traditional teachings.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That actually touched on a question I was going to ask, which is we've had the same understanding as we've engaged with different communities. The word disability we've heard doesn't exist. There's instead like descriptive words maybe that would describe other things around it, but not necessarily disabled or disability. What isn't a word that exists. So it's nice to hear that like back to me that we're getting the right information. Um, how would you describe the roles of community members with disabilities traditionally?
Well, I think I also answered that a little bit in the last question, whereas they would, depending on their gifts that they bring and the strengths they have, they would contribute to their communities in a way that was meaningful and inclusive and supportive. Um, there's always room in the circle, and everybody plays a different role in their community. And I think most of us have heard the term "it takes a village." It absolutely does. When raising a child, a family member with a disability or diverse ability or unique gifts and strengths. And so um, that is kind of how I would answer that. I do have, a lot more to share on that topic and from a more specific perspective in terms of the child's circle of support and how family and community and our system as a whole can wrap a child in their circle of support and really um, support them to reach their best potential. And so I look forward to getting into that further on in the interview.
Thank you. My next question, which you kind of also did answer, is like, how is community members with disabilities, how has that changed over time, which you did say, but I guess I want to ask the change over time, which is, I guess, being less included and being like lifted up. How would you say these changes have impacted community members with disabilities?
Um, Members with disabilities face significant barriers, uh, barriers within the larger systems, um, barriers within their communities as well. More so nowadays than traditionally. As I said, there's always room in the circle, and and we don't always find that in today's society. There, there are a lot of closed doors if you don't have a diagnosis. And, it is my understanding that from an Indigenous perspective, because of there not being a word in most of the Indigenous languages and there not being that same perspective on disability, that often Indigenous families um, might be more resistant to embracing the process of getting assessment, getting a diagnosis. And the system is more colonial in the sense that you need to have a diagnosis in a lot of cases to receive the services that your child might benefit from and the additional funding that comes along with that. And so um, we would love for it to shift towards a more needs-based approach, but often funding requires that diagnosis-based approach. Not all cases, there are some more open and flexible funding options like Jordan's Principle, and in British Columbia, the Métis Wellbeing Program through Métis Nation BC. But funding options through the government often require a diagnosis.
Thank you so much. Would it be possible for you to share with us any traditional teachings of disability which you may know of?
So I do believe I kind of answered that in when I said that children are a gift from Creator, born to be nurtured, loved, and cared for, and their unique strengths are lifted up. And woven into the community that they're being raised in and celebrated, um, as opposed to that more negative um, construct and perspective when even looking at the word disability. Um, Putting dis in front of the word ability does bring that more negative context. However, I also acknowledge that disability is a rights-based term used within legislation. And so it's the word that we commonly need to use within the Canadian system to advocate for the needs and rights of our members of community that have a disability or differing ability or diverse ability or unique gift.
Thank you so much. Are there any depictions of disability in traditional art, music, and dance which you may know of?
Um, I would like to pass on that question, please.
Totally fair. Are there any traditional cultural or community practices which you would describe as being inclusive to community members with disabilities
Oh,
within the
you're on
Métis
mute.
context?
Um, so in terms of, can you repeat that again? I'm sorry, because you kind of cut out there.
I know, and then your brain got it's totally fair. Are there any traditional cultural or community practices which you would describe as being inclusive to community members with disabilities within the Métis context?
Absolutely. So within Métis culture and within First Nations culture, um, drumming. Drumming is very inclusive. I've led many, countless drum circles, and the drum is the heartbeat of Mother Earth. And so what I've found is that children with diverse abilities, with disabilities, really gravitate to that. Um, for some, it can be a sensory overload in terms of auditory processing. But once they develop that comfort to it, or even the vibration of it, perhaps they have headphones on to help with that sound. Or even if they are hard of hearing or deaf, they can still feel that vibration. And I've had children put their face to the drum and just feel it and be so calmed, and it helps with regulation. And um and drum circles are very inclusive. They're, you find another spot around the big drum, around the grandmother drum. You can have hand drums in varying sizes. Um, and support workers or family members can help those with disabilities participate in drumming if they don't have use of their limbs. And so there's just a lot of ways to embrace drumming as a universal and inclusive traditional practice, as well as smudging. Smudging also can be very powerful for individuals with disabilities, um, and you know embracing the smoke from the smudge, for some with complex medical needs, that might not be the right fit. But there are many different traditional ways to embrace culture with those with disabilities, being out in nature, and going on plant medicine walks with an elder. Um, Talking circles are fun too. Having a talking circle with and as an inclusive experience. And I've even had a talking circle where individuals use adaptive communication devices to support them to um, contribute to the talking circle and share their voice in a different way. And so, traditionally, you always find a way to include those with disabilities or differing abilities and embrace their unique gifts and celebrate them together. Food is also universal. So feasting and potlatches and, you know, sharing food together is a wonderful way to connect and build those relationships. And so sometimes, um, well, you need to start move at the speed of trust. And so forming that relationship with all members, regardless of their abilities, and then over time, including them in other practices that they can participate in a meaningful way.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing response. I appreciate that. Um, Now, thinking about the importance of elders and knowledge keepers, in your view, what role do elders and knowledge keepers play in terms of passing down traditional knowledge of disability?
Elders and knowledge keepers pass down many teachings, and the teachings on disability and inclusion are one of them. And that's when, I've said a couple times now in this interview, there's always room in the circle. That is a teaching of inclusion. You find another chair at the table, at a Métis. When you're having a kitchen party, there's room in the dance circle. So you make space and um, and you welcome with open arms and you listen. Um, however however that means to listen to that individual with whatever voice they have or communication they're using. Because some communicate, as I shared, with adaptive communication devices or through sign language. And traditionally, when our languages were against the law, there was sign language incorporated into that, and into how we could communicate with each other. Um, so elders hold those stories that we pass on, and and as I shared, my elders have been instrumental in informing my view, and teaching me the difference in an Indigenous perspective on disability versus a Western or colonial perspective on disability, and seeing everyone as a gift from Creator, and how can they best contribute to their communities, but also to themselves and their families. And in terms of listening to their stories and their journeys, one of my elders said, we were gifted with two eyes or two ears and one mouth for a reason. So we can always listen actively. But we have a third ear that's important to acknowledge, and that's the ear of our heart, listening with our heart.
Thank you so much. Um, where and when do elders and knowledge keepers typically share these teachings?
When they are welcomed into community, when they are invited in, elders will share these teachings. I work alongside some incredible elders in the Indigenous Advisory Circle that I chair through my work role at the Family Support Institute of BC. I've also worked alongside many elders in a variety of work capacities over the last 25 years. Elders can be very supportive in a family and child circle of support on their personal journey, which I've also had the honor of experiencing and continue to experience. My mom is now an ancestor, and she was my biggest support. And I've been embraced by my elders to that have willingly and wholefully from their soul stepped into that matriarchal role to provide that support, because this is a journey, and there's different stages you go through in the journey of raising a family member, a child with disabilities, and wrapping yourself with support so that you can be strong for your loved one is very important, so that you can ensure that you are the best you can be to help them be the best they can be.
Thank you so much. Um, uh, what role do, oh, you actually, never mind, you answered that. How do you think traditional understandings and practices of disability could serve community members with disabilities?
I feel like it would create a better sense of belonging. I feel like they would have that um, feel that sense of inclusion within their community if we took a more traditional approach to our relations with indigenous peoples with disabilities. I feel like they would have their voices heard more, have their needs met more, and their rights actualized more and honored. I feel like they would feel more honored if we took that indigenous traditional approach.
Thank you so much. Um, Now, tying all of this to your career, how would you say traditional knowledge of disability has shaped your professional practice?
My traditional knowledge of disability has shaped my professional practice by weaving in my personal experience as well. So, as a parent of a child with complex support needs, I developed a model called Trinity's Ecological Model of Supports. And I started to share this through a workshop I developed called The Power of Early Intervention, sharing Trinity's story and this model because I felt like it could help more families. And in 2014, I was presenting at the BC Aboriginal Childcare Society's conference. And the provincial advisor for Aboriginal supported child development programs of BC was in my workshop. And she approached me afterwards in tears, saying, Laranna, this is incredible. I feel like this could help more families across our province. And she invited me to be the provincial parent rep on their policy working group to update their provincial policy practice guidelines manual. And in 2017, they released their updated manual, which they still use today. And they've adapted Trinity's ecological model of supports to create the child's circle of support. And they acknowledge us, they mention us in this document. It's still shared at every workshop that they offer, and it's part of the core of what they do, placing the child at the center of this circle and wrapping them with the quadrants of the medicine wheel. And then around that is our primary supports, those who are supporting the child the most and involved in the child's life the most. And then around them are the consultative and secondary supports. And then around them are the long-term supports. And this is a model that I wanted to share with you all because I feel like this is something that belongs not only in British Columbia, but across our nation to help all Indigenous families who have a child or family member with a disability. Um, every child deserves a circle of support, and it can help. It's changed provincial policy in our province, and it can help other professionals in this field um, in a number of ways, whether it's through an intake process and helping to define with the family who's in their circle of support so that we can fill in the gaps and bridge them to programs and resources to strengthen their circle of support. Because when we get a child the support they need within the first 7 years of their life, it can change their whole developmental trajectory because the brain develops the most in the first 7 years. And so that's why I called Trinity's presentation The Power of Early Intervention, because she was never supposed to walk or talk due to her complex support needs. But she walks, she talks, she runs, she reads, she sings, she dances, she drums. She's a bright light of hope and inspiration that is a model for what early intervention can do. And in her circle of support, she had speech and language, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, child development consultant, support workers, infant development consultant, eventually Aboriginal supported child development consultant, a pediatrician, a neurologist, so many things in her, so many players in her circle of support. And that's why I had to draw it out. I literally started drawing this model to map out who was working with my child when, how often, what their role was, so I could visualize it in my life and in my brain and help me cope with um, this huge shift in perspective and welcoming in these supports to help me help her have a better life. And our MLA at the time brought Trinity's case up through the legislature. She was focused on or showcased on global TV on the 6 o'clock news, and it was a trickle down effect to helping other families across our province. And I continue to advocate not only for her, but for all families that have a child or family member with disabilities. And that's a big part of my role with the Family Support Institute of BC is raising families' voices to affect change. Um, and I started doing that as a parent. And now I have the honor of doing that also as a professional at a provincial level.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Um, Trinity sounds amazing. Like a party all on her own.
Right? So I have resources I would like to share and offer um, to help inform this work so you have an idea of what I'm talking about. Those visuals, that manual. I also have the news clip that I'm happy to share. And so that's part of our story. That's part of our journey. And if by telling our story, we can help more families be the voice for those that don't have one, because Trinity didn't have one yet. She was just little when I started this advocacy journey because we were told at 6 months old that that may be the outcome for her. And I was not prepared to accept that. No, with my background in child development, I know that I knew that I could make a difference in her life and have that not be her outcome and have her story be a success and one to celebrate and honor and share with others to inspire and motivate them to keep going.
Thank you so much. Um, I guess now kind of tying all this together, would you say that traditional knowledge of disability has helped you navigate your experience of disability in caring and advocating for your daughter and professionally in the end as well?
Absolutely. Even before I, you know, heard this from a number of elders professionally, I believed in my heart and held the perspective of children being a gift from Creator. And when we see it in that light, that, we may have thought that we were going to go on this one path. Creator had a different path for me to take, and it was a beautiful gift, even though I didn't know it was coming. Um, and the teachings I have embraced along the way and the supports that I have received and passed down to my daughter and to those that I professionally work with, um, holding that traditional perspective and that from a positive light. It's not a bad thing to have a disability. It's a gift. And there are many teachings within that gift. And sometimes we don't see it right away. And we need that support in order to open our eyes to this new journey. But it's a beautiful journey. And it's one that's very amazing to embrace.
Thank you so much. Um, are there any traditional teachings or cultural practices which have helped you and your family navigate disability? I, yeah, that's the question.
So, in terms of navigating disability, absolutely having that circle of support. But in terms of coping through the journey, weaving in those traditional practices have absolutely been instrumental in helping me to be on this journey in a good way. And so spending time with my elders, drumming in ceremony, smudging before meetings or after difficult conversations, um, or at a number of different points, that cleansing of the negative energy, um, facilitating respectful communication through talking circles, um, not only through my professional practice, but in my personal life and my work with my daughter. So absolutely embracing, being on the land that has, being on the land and being by the river, having um, that connection that has absolutely helped me on this journey. And I feel that it is so important to take care of yourself on this journey because it's not an easy one. It does come with its bumps in the road, its diversions, its surprises. So really ensuring that you are well and your wellness is at the forefront so that you can be the best you can be for your family member. And that is absolutely a traditional perspective of ensuring that our wellness is supported. Um, and in terms of, from a Métis perspective, Kawichi Haitoyak, we take care of each other. Um, that is so important uh, because I couldn't be here and do the work I do and for my daughter or for the families that I have supported over the years, or for the staff that I support now, without having others take care of me as well.
Thank you so much. I actually just had a thought. Was there any words in the Métis language used to describe disabilities?
No,
I know it seems redundant, but I just want to have you recorded saying that. Sorry.
yes,
I know we kind of did touch on it, but just to
yeah, not to my knowledge. No, it was never brought up in that way to me. Um, Again, it was a gift. And, that perspective of Kawichi Haitoyak, we take care of each other. That's very powerful. And Métis Nation BC released a book. They have a resource out there all about Kawichi Haitoyak and how we take care of each other from a Métis perspective. So it's just a different way of knowing and being.
thank you so much. Now, given your personal and professional connection to disability, we would like to ask you about some recommendations for disability support systems. Um, as a parent of a child with complex support needs, what gaps have you encountered in the current system?
There are a number of gaps that families have to find ways around or be waitlisted for. Waitlist is a huge gap. Um, we are blessed with a strong circle of support that has changed over time. Um, but it depends on where you live. There could be more gaps if you're in a rural or remote community, depending on the services available in your community, in your region. There's funding discrepancies depending on where you live. And there's often times that you have to travel out of community for certain services, which can be a huge barrier for some families. Some of the criteria in order to qualify for certain programs within our province, the assessments are deficit based. which is a huge barrier. You're asked to paint the worst picture of your child when, from an Indigenous perspective, we're very strength-based. Um, and so that also goes against your cultural beliefs and perhaps your personal values. And so, as one of the hats I wear, in addition to being Trinity's mom and the Indigenous Practice Advisor with FSI, is the Interior Region Parent Rep on the Ministers Advisory Council for Children and Youth with Support Needs in BC. And so at that table, we identify those gaps and those barriers and those systemic changes that need to be made. And BC is currently looking at how we can improve the system overall for children and youth with support needs in our province, because there are a number of gaps. As I shared previously, the assessment and diagnosis is often a barrier and a gap. There are families are sometimes waitlisted for 6 months to 2 years for an assessment. And that assessment and that diagnosis will get you the additional support within the school system or funding support from the government. And families are left to struggle and wait. Programs aren't, there's funding is a huge barrier and a huge gap. Yes, there is a lot of funding that has been available within the disability sector, but the statistics indicate and prove that the number of families that have a child or family member with a disability continue to increase. And so the funding doesn't meet the need. And that has been going on, in my experience, for over a decade. And it doesn't seem to be improving any, because the gaps are getting larger and more people's lives are at risk in a number of different systems as a result of not being able to keep up with the demand. And that is not only in the children's systems, but also in adult systems. And when you have a disability, it's often for the lifespan. And so having that continuity of care across systems, across the lifespan, is imperative. So that's a little bit on that. I could probably talk for a whole hour on all of the gaps and ways that we can improve our systems. But, having those trained professionals be able to come to families, meet them where they're at, walk alongside families at their pace, take the time to form those relationships, leave the paperwork for another time. When you come into a visit and you have this agenda and these forms to fill out, it's really hard to develop a relationship, and because that's not the focus. Having the relationship be the focus first and moving at the speed of trust and approaching services from a needs-based perspective with healthy budgets would make a world of a difference.
Thank you so much. In your view, what cultural strengths or practices could be incorporated, traditional strengths and practices could be incorporated into today's disability support systems?
I strongly feel that the child circle of support model could complement the disability sector and inform policy across our nation to support all families to have their needs met in their community. And if it can't be in their community, support them financially to seek those services outside of their community. And yeah, when you have to take a child 8 hours to Children's Hospital for specialist appointments, that's a huge barrier. And it comes with a lot of challenges for families. And so sometimes it's really difficult to follow through with that. Um, Virtual supports are great, but it doesn't replace that in-person support. And you can't do all visits virtually. There are some that you need to have that in-person connection for, but we have learned the benefits that technology can bring to the sector, and many sectors. But I caution the overuse of technology uh, when you're wanting to build relationships with Indigenous families and communities and individuals with disabilities. Um, yeah.
Thank you so much. Um, what role could Indigenous communities play in shaping disability policy?
Indigenous communities can be the voice of their people for those that don't have a voice or are afraid to use their voice. They can advocate, they can support their communities uh, through funding, dedicating funds that their nation gets to supporting those with disabilities from and incorporating the teachings from their nation and their elders into those services, because there is no one approach that we can apply for Indigenous communities. It is distinctions based and nation based. And so it's really important for us to acknowledge that and not apply a pan Indigenous approach. And when you weave in a circle of support, that can look differently depending on which nation or which Indigenous community or culture that you're connected to. And so I feel like that is imperative for us to acknowledge that it really needs to come from community and the teachings of the elders in those communities and working with the leadership in those communities. And, it's going to look differently for our Inuit families than our maybe our than our Métis families and our First Nations families. In BC alone, we have over 200 different First Nations communities. And so it's really important to acknowledge um, those different traditions and practices and beliefs and languages and Indigenous languages and practices and ceremonies. Culture is medicine. And we don't have one Indigenous culture. There are many Indigenous cultures for us to acknowledge and honor and embrace.
Thank you so much. Um, what would you say for, I guess, within the context of like your Métis community, um, what role could they play in shaping disability policy or your own community? I think you said, I don't want to get it wrong, boundary?
Right. So in British Columbia, through Métis Nation BC, we have a number of Métis chartered communities. And the Boundary Métis Community Association is part of that larger collective. And in British Columbia, through Métis Nation BC, we also have something called the Wellbeing Program, which is the complement to Jordan's Principle, because Métis children do not qualify for Jordan's Principle. So through the Wellbeing Program, children birth to 8 years old their families can apply for different for funding that could support respite, assessments, specialized equipment, to further meet the needs of Métis children with disabilities. What I could see as an opportunity is expanding that program to be birth to 18 or even birth to 19 until they transition into the adult system, and further enhancing programs for our adults as well. CLBC, Community Living of British Columbia, does have an Indigenous relations team that is doing work on with communities to and working with them to do funding agreements so that they can provide disability services within the context of their community. And so that is something that we need to see more of. And, you know, it's wonderful that they're taking those steps in that direction. But that journey is just, you know, has only begun a couple of years ago. So there's lots of work to be done. Personally, the Boundary Métis Community Association, when Trinity was very little and waitlisted for a number of services, started an annual fishing derby. Well, it was the first fishing derby, and it has now become annual. And it's an ice fishing derby, and they raised funding for children in our community with support needs. And that annual fishing derby goes on over 10 years later to support children and youth in our community that fall through the cracks and that might need a little extra support in certain areas. And so communities can come together to support families in different ways and raise these issues at the tables and circles and advisories that they sit on, and working with those within those roles, whether it is an MLA or an MP or, you know, your local mayor or your local chief and council, to raise these issues and raise the voice, elevate the voice of our disability sector so that we're not forgotten and we are included and we find our place of belonging in our communities. And so that is how our partners within those roles can support us to further policy changes and enhance funding opportunities for our families.
Thank you so much. Finally, as part of our work, we are consulting with narrators about the project title, Voice of Inclusion, Oral Histories of Indigenous Disability. What comes to mind when you hear our project title?
I love it. It's a great title, because traditionally our knowledge was passed down orally. And, you know, Voices of Inclusion. It's a beautiful, beautiful title. And so I'm truly honored to be able to share our story with you and to have the opportunity to support this work. It is something that is near and dear to my heart and has been a passion of mine ever since I was gifted with my beautiful daughter 14 years ago.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the comments. What would you most like to see as an outcome of this work?
Well, I do feel that interviews, video clips are very powerful. A written report, statistics, including statistics, is very is what the government wants to see. And according to the Assembly of First Nations, 20 to 50% of Indigenous families have a disability, or have somebody in their life with a disability. And so that number is often higher than non-Indigenous families. BCANDS, the BC Aboriginal Network on Disability Society, also shares that 1 in 3 Indigenous people have a disability, and that women are often have a disability more so than men. That was a recent statistic they released. I've had the honor of um, working with BCANDS and Indigenous Disability Canada. I often refer families to their work so they can support them on their journey. I feel that having follow-up opportunities virtually to share about the outcomes of this report, um, as well as a place online so people can read about it. Um, and, you know, perhaps province-based or territory-based report backs as well. I imagine you've been interviewing people from across Canada. And so having, stories from BC, stories from Alberta, as well as a national overview could really capture people's attention and promote further changes within their province or territory. Um, yeah.
Thank you so much. What
And
would you most,
infographics are always great too, right? Visual, having some visuals.
I agree. What would you most like others to know about Indigenous disability?
I think I've covered that in a lot of what I've shared. What I want others to know about Indigenous disability is that it's a gift that should be honored and celebrated and supported in the context of their family, their community, and within our nation of Canada, so across Canada. And yeah.
Um, Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate it. Before we conclude, is there anything else you would like to add? Basically, the floor is yours. Say whatever you would like. This is your cameo moment.
Well, it has truly been an honor to participate in this project. I raise my hands to you all for doing this work. Thank you so much, Marcy. I I will be sharing some additional resources for you to consider, and if you feel it appropriate to share those resources out or include a link for anything, I welcome that. Um, consider them a gift to this project and this work you are all doing. And I welcome any follow-up opportunities to support this work together and to um, promote what you're doing through the Voices of Inclusion, but also what Indigenous Disability Canada is doing across our nation, our country. And I'm just truly honored to be in circle with you today. So again, Marcy, thank you.
Thank you so much. It has been a joy. You are very well spoken. You were great to interview.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. Anna's probably just gonna stop the recording, but we can keep talking.